there seems to be some indication that South Africa is changing. Is this hyperbolic, or do you think there's some truth in that?
So running coalitions is enormously difficult. But what is the most difficult of all is being the smaller party in a coalition. It's very rich for the analyst to say, well, the DA had to compromise on this, how terrible. Of course we had to compromise. And the more votes we get, the less we'll have to compromise.
Ideologically speaking, what is your concern with the ANC's approach to helping the poor?
What the ANC has delivered is mass and growing unemployment, infrastructure collapse, and poverty.
There was some form of an agreement on the Bella Bill, but the question is, what is your view on this? Because it seems that this will go to court, and what is the way forward?
The time to say things is when it's difficult to say them, not when it's easy to say them, and it's all obvious in retrospect.
Do you think the back of wokeness has been broken with people like Trump and what's happening all over the world?
Yeah, I do.
Welcome to the Pioneer Podcast. This is Ernst Roots. And if you've been paying attention to South Africa over the last year or the last few months, you would certainly know that South Africa seems to be changing. What we need to find out is whether these changes are for the good or whether the situation could worsen. South Africa had a very important and in some ways a historic election in the year 2024 when the ruling party, the ANC, that has been in power for 30 years has dropped dramatically, falling to below 50%, in fact ending up with 40% of the support, leading to the creation of a government of national unity, or a GNU, which is now governing South Africa, a government that includes some of the opposition parties. But another interesting fact is also that voter turnout has dropped dramatically. Which might indicate that people are frustrated or annoyed with the system. Perhaps there are other interpretations for this. But a big question now in South Africa is what ought to be done under these circumstances, and especially what the opposition parties who are now part of this government of national unity ought to do. Now, in this conversation, we want to talk about that, but we also want to have a bit of a broader conversation about the situation in South Africa, some of the problems, how to make sense of what's happening in South Africa, the direction, and also what ought to be done. And we are very happy and privileged to have Hellen Zille with us in studio today, the chairperson of the Federal Council of the DA, the Democratic Alliance. Helen, thank you very much. It's a great privilege to have you on the podcast. So thank you very much for being here.
It's a privilege for me to have been asked. Thank you.
So let's start with the situation in South Africa and that introduction I gave. Firstly, whether you agree that last year was a historic year for South Africa and that there seems to be some indication that South Africa is changing. Is this hyperbolic, or do you think there's some truth in that?
No, I think it's actually an understatement. It was a historic election. And for the first time, single-party domination in South Africa has been broken for the first time in many, many decades, because we've had single-party domination in South Africa since the 1950s.
Yes.
And so here we are now in a situation where there are many more political checks and balances in the system, and we're in a much better position to try to defend the Constitution. So it was a momentous and historic election. And the ANC, as the biggest party still, we fell under 40% actually, but as the biggest party still, they got to keep the presidency and to do much to shape the coalition that they went into. And they had a choice. They could have gone with the far-right populists. They could have gone with the racial nationalists, who are the same as the far-right populists, or they could have gone with us. And I think it's very important, probably due to some good negotiating strategy as well, that they made the choice to focus on us and form a government of national unity than trying to get Jacob Zuma back into the fold and get above 50% through Jacob Zuma's new Mkhonto weSizwe party. So that was a very important step for South Africa, because if it had gone the other way, things would look very different today.
So one person whose name has been mentioned a few times, one historic figure on this podcast in previous episodes is Jan Smuts. And Jan Smuts made a remark that really stuck with me when he spoke in the British Parliament in London during the war, the Second World War. And he spoke about the war, and he was a very celebrated figure. And he said during his speech, he said, "Rest assured, I'm not going to be talking about matters of strategy for the war. I will leave that to the amateur strategists, because the great thing of being an amateur strategist is you have the freedom to say whatever you want, and you don't have to live with the consequences of your decisions." And so I've been thinking about that in the run-up to this discussion, because politics is almost like sports, like rugby. Everyone who's sitting on the pavilion believe they know what ought to be done. And what I think what happened, or what I perceived what happened is everyone had this sigh of relief with the election results and the government of national unity. And what we also experience or perceive is that a lot of people are starting to get tense again with what they believe ought to be done. And they believe the DA should be doing the following, they should not be doing that. And one of the great concerns is whether not just the DA, but the other parties who are part of this would become rubber stamps for the ruling party. Is this something that we should be concerned about, or what is your view about how this ought to be approached?
Well, coalitions are very, very difficult indeed. I was in the first coalition ever in the New South Africa in 1999. That only lasted 2 years before it blew apart. And I was also in another 7-party coalition in Cape Town from 2006. And that held, fortunately, and that was the basis of winning an overall majority in Cape Town at a later point, and in the Western Cape. So running coalitions is enormously difficult. But what is the most difficult of all is being the smaller party in a coalition. Now, the Government of National Unity is a coalition. And to be a party in a bona fide coalition, you have to have leverage. You have to be able to bring the government down if you leave, and that is what gives you the leverage. And there's always a massive risk for the smaller party, because there is a great risk of being sucked into the program of the dominant party, for the dominant party to get all the credit when things go right, and for the smaller party to get all the blame when things go wrong. That happens all over the world all the time, and we've learned many very important lessons. But in our case, the odds were particularly high, because we could either have said, we're not interested in this role, we'd prefer to stay in opposition, which of course is our comfort zone. We could either say that, or we could say, look, if the ANC goes together with the racial nationalist socialists and people following the so-called National Democratic Revolution, like Jacob Zuma and Julius Malema, that will be the end of the economy in South Africa.
Yes.
It'll set us back decades, and we don't know if we'll ever be able to recover from it. So that is the context in which we have to make those decisions, which in a way makes it easier for us, but in a way makes it much more difficult for us, because I'm sure Ramaphosa is sitting there thinking to himself, well, the DA is now in, that's good, that's what I wanted, but the DA can't get out, because the DA knows that if they do get out, then MK and Jacob Zuma gets back into the fold, which is what he wants, and we sit there with the collapse of the South African economy, and the DA is not going to survive that amongst its voters.
Yes.
So I reckon that he's made that mental calculation, and that means he treats us a bit like an abused wife sometimes, but the DA is not prepared to be treated like an abused wife, and we are strengthening our voice more and more in the forums where it matters, and there are issues that are going to be ones in which there is major contestation. We're not going to win everything. We're not even going to win most things. If people want us to win most things, then we must get more votes. You can't get 22% of the vote and then have your support base thinking you can run the government on your own. You can't. The ANC is almost double the size that we are. That is just a reality of South African politics. I wish it weren't so, but it is so. And so we have to deal with the reality of the situation. So we're not going to win everything. And sometimes when we don't win something, it's very rich for the analyst to say, well, the DA had to compromise on this, how terrible. Of course we had to compromise. And the more votes we get, the less we'll have to compromise. And that is the choice of the voters.
Yeah. So a friend of mine who was in politics once said to me that the problem with politics is it's always a choice between bad and worse. He actually used stronger terms and Afrikaans terms, but you can call it bad and worse. And obviously one wants to be more optimistic and say there's a choice between different goods. Which good do you pursue? But in a certain sense, it does seem to me that the situation at the moment is the one bad is, or the one side, or to the one extreme is a situation where these other parties, MK or the EFF, these parties come into government, and that needs to be prevented. But on the other side, the risk is this government of national unity then with the opposition parties simply becoming a forum for ANC policies. And it's easy if it goes wrong in the one direction to say, well, you should have done the other thing. But I'm curious on that balance. In other words, at what point is it appropriate to say we have to step out? Or at how do we approach, what's the correct way to approach this balance?
Well, that's the judgment that we have to make every single day. And we also have to decide whether and then when we use what we term the nuclear option, which is when you bring the government down.
Yes.
And that's not an easy thing to do because you can only do that once.
Yeah.
And if you don't take your voters with you on that decision, you're going to live to regret it very greatly. Because when you leave and you walk out, there's one big gesture for one day, and a week later people are saying, but you could have still been in there, you could have been influencing this, you could have been influencing that. And so the question is, on what issue and at what point is a line crossed that enables us to say, this is the end, and we think that decision will be right, not only for now, but for next month and for next year. Because it's easy in politics to take a bold decision in the spur of the moment. And it's easy in politics to make grand gestures. But grand gestures have consequences, and the consequences are often very unintended, and you have to live with the consequences of those choices.
So if I can change gears, you were recently in what we say in Afrikaans, a bakgeveg, or a public feud with the deputy president, when he accused, I think the party, the DA, of not caring for the poor and so forth, and you responded. But thinking and reading his comments and reading your response to that, on the one hand, it's very strange to hear someone from the ANC accusing others of not caring for the poor. And I think the underlying issue here is perhaps an issue of definition. So what does it mean to care for the poor? Because if the deputy president is truly serious in his remark, the question is, what does it mean if you're a member of the ANC, what does caring for the poor look like? And it certainly looks different for you. So I'd like for you to comment on that balance.
Yes, well, the deputy president knows that he's talking nonsense in the first place. Secondly, it's an old trope that the ANC uses very successfully. They come out and say, we were the party who fought for liberation. Of course, there was precious little fighting at all, and they claim that this great liberation struggle involved a lot of fighting. We'll leave that there. That's not the point we're discussing now. But they said the ANC will liberate you. We are here as the liberators. And what's happened? All of their policies have made a small group of ANC insiders fabulously wealthy. They've stripped the state. They've bankrupted many government departments. They can't run a balanced budget. Services for the poor and infrastructure is collapsing everywhere. And so all they have to do is play the race card.
Yes.
Now, that is a fig leaf for the race card. What he's basically saying is, and he said it in so many words, the DA cares for the middle-class suburbs. They don't care about the poor. They That is complete nonsense. If you look at the budget of Cape Town, you will see from the rates income, 9 billion, 75% of that is spent on developing infrastructure for poor communities. There is another massive transfer of subsidies so that services for poor people are free, and then the additional subsidies to make them more affordable when you have to start paying. The amount of cross-subsidization and development in the poorest of the poor areas goes beyond what any other local government and provincial government does in the whole country. So if you compare DA governance purely on spend and delivery to the poor and lack of corruption so that money is there that genuinely makes the difference, you will see that there is one truly pro-poor party in South Africa, and that is the DA. Yes. The ANC is pro-poverty, but they use the fig leaf of this tired old trope to claim we are on your side because we are black and therefore we fight poverty. What they're basically meaning is we've made ourselves obscenely rich, and on your behalf we have become obscenely rich in our fight against poverty. So, people must start seeing through that. But it is very difficult in a context where there are so many deep divisions and historical divisions, race, ethnicity, and especially cultural divisions, to enable people to understand what the issues should be on which they are voting.
Yes. So you mentioned the National Democratic Revolution, and as you know, many of our viewers or listeners of this podcast are outside of South Africa, and perhaps it would be good if you can explain the short version of what that means. What is the National Democratic Revolution? And then a second question, which is probably the same question, just put differently, is what do you think, ideologically speaking, what is your concern with the ANC's approach to helping the poor?
Well, the National Democratic Revolution is a Leninist term that comes from Soviet Russia. And in its simplest essence, it refers to a system in which the leader of the dominant political party, usually the only political party, controls the party with an iron hand. The party controls the state, and the state controls the economy and society. That is what the National Democratic Revolution is, stripped of everything else. It is autocracy. It is even totalitarianism, you may say. Certainly in a one-party system, it's that. And the ANC says we are the only party that can bring you liberation, but only if you vote for us and enable us to control the state and enable us to use the machinery of state to transfer things to the poor. Now, I don't know what they're wanting to transfer because the Constitution is very clear. The only party that's doing those transfers is the Democratic Alliance. We are doing the job that the state is supposed to be doing at local and at provincial level. We are building infrastructure. We are delivering water, electricity, roads, filling potholes, refuse removal, sewerage works, public transport, schools, clinics. That's how you transfer and empower people to have equal opportunities. If the ANC keeps this crazy promise alive, that if people keep voting for the ANC, everybody will live in a 4-bedroom house in a smart suburb with a car in a garage, they're crazy. Because the ANC policies are destroying the economy. And people in any country such as ours have to be able to contribute to their own housing. And if they are unemployed, they can't do that. And what the ANC has delivered is mass and growing unemployment, infrastructure collapse, and poverty.
Yet, we saw this again with this 100 billion rand fund that they want to start for black businesses. Yet, we are being told that the solution to these failures is more aggressive socialism. So the solution to the problem of South Africa's farms is expropriation without compensation. The solution to state hospitals not working is national health insurance. The solution to the economy not working is more aggressive black economic empowerment. So we've mentioned this before on some of our episodes. It's almost a war against reality. We are being told that we have to reject what we know to be true to buy into this ideology. But it has to be a bubble that has to burst sometime. Or do you think how long do you think they can carry on with this?
Well, it's an extraordinary argument, but it is an ideological cage. People cannot get rid of the idea that if there is a problem in society, the state must take more power to solve it. And if the entire record attests to the state doing the opposite in every sphere, it's very easy to simply, from an ideological perspective, say the state has not got enough power and enough control. We need more. And that is the trap, the ideological trap that the ANC and many of its supporters are in. Now let's take the sphere of education. There's some outstanding public schools that work very, very well. There are the vast majority that the ANC has completely failed to improve, and in some instances they've got worse.
Yes.
And young kids can't have opportunities in life if they don't have a decent education. It's simply the way of the world now. And you would think that a government would say, why are these schools not working and what can we do to fix them? Instead, they say, why are some schools working and how can we control them to force them to do what we want? The very reason that why some schools are working is that they keep the government as far away as possible.
We have more active community involvement,
Far
strong
more
governing bodies.
Strong governing bodies, committed teachers, good time management, finishing the curriculum on time, all of those basics. And the ANC can't even think of getting those basics right. All they have to do is say, no, it's not fair that you're doing better than this one. And if this one isn't having, you may not have either. It's that philosophy.
Yes. So on the education thing, there was some form of an agreement on the Bella Bill, but the question is, what is your view on this? Because it seems that this will go to court, and what is the way forward?
Well, we're working very hard to try and find a constructive way forward. But I think, and it's a story that very few people know, this again reflects how devious the ANC is. They are completely devious, and you can never accept what they say at face value. So there was a difference of opinion on this, as you know. It went to the formal institutional forum where disputes between the state and unions are resolved. It's called NEDLAC. NEDLAC came up with a very constructive approach to say, right, we'll have the Bella Act, but not without the norms, standards, and regulations that the DA Minister of Education must draw up. And we went to the clearinghouse and we said the same thing. And we put two options on the table because we agreed that we'd give the president options. And the one was that the president would set the deadline for the norms, standards, and regulations to be finalized. And the other one was that the minister, the DA minister, would set the deadline for when the norms, standards, and regulations would be finished. That was the option. We all agreed. We'd spent weeks negotiating it, a lot of hard work, a lot of writing, a lot of legal analysis. Fine. On the day that we have to hand it in, right then, we flew to the president's guest house in Pretoria. We sat down and we had a final discussion right at the end. A representative of one of the smaller parties puts up his hand. He says, I'd like to add a third option. I said, I know what is coming now. This has been planned from the beginning. He puts up his hands. He says, I want a third option, that the Bella Bill be implemented unconditionally and immediately. I said, excuse me, why didn't you bring that up at the beginning? Why did you jolly us along for all of this time, and now at number 99 and 0.9, you come up with an option that we can't even discuss? Because after this meeting, the report has to go to the president. I looked at everybody and I saw it had been a strategy from the beginning. This person in a smaller party had agreed that he was going to slip that in at the last minute. Strategy agreed with Andre Snell and others. They were going to do that. I objected heavily. The deputy president closes the meeting. Of course, the report then includes the third option, and the president chooses the third option. That's
incredible.
How devious and manipulative it is.
Well, the concern with that is that whole thing about politics and how the sausage is made is people don't know all these details. And I think there's a real risk then of people reading, oh, well, there's a government of national unity that has agreed that the Bella Bill needs to be implemented. And so from a DA perspective, how do we deal with that?
Yeah, well, you see, that's one of the difficulties. Now, do we say, right, because you are so devious and manipulative and dishonest, we're out of here? My instinct is often in those cases, because I'm a quite absolutist, black or white individual. I decide what something's right or something is wrong, and I act accordingly. However, you must think of what's going to happen next week and the week after, and you must think of perhaps having an EFF or MK, Minister of Education, and what that would look like. So you've got to understand what the consequences are.
Yes.
And so, of course, despite that unbelievably dishonest maneuver, we have continued trying to find a solution that doesn't destroy our good schools with other actors in what we call the whole of society approach.
Can I, there's another, it's linked to this, but I want to sort of shift gears again and talk a bit about the DA's, let's say the DA were to govern South Africa. Now there's a story, I'm very fascinated by the story of the founding of America, the founding fathers, and there was a big debate, especially between Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson. And Hamilton was more the big government guy, and Jefferson was more for decentralization. And I want to get to decentralization after this. And Jefferson campaigned on the idea that government is too big, we need to make government smaller. And someone asked Hamilton at one point, but are you concerned what will happen if Jefferson becomes president? And he said, not really, because once he feels the power, he's not going to let go. And that's much of what happened. When Jefferson became president, he didn't make all the cuts that he wanted. And so it seems to me that a lot of what the DA policies boil down to is smaller government, less government interference, more private sector, and so forth. Are you concerned that this might be a reality? Hypothetically, let's say the DA were to win the next election, and the DA suddenly has the power, that the party might say, well, actually, we need to keep this power. What's your view on this?
Well, if Eskom was still functioning the way it did under the people who originally began it and ran it successfully as one of the world's best electricity utilities, maybe you could argue that it's useful to have a state utility of that kind.
Yeah.
But the thing is, the DA likes things to work, and our voters expect things to work. And so if we're in power and stuff is not working, we will move to make it work. And the best way to make things work is to ensure that the private sector has a key role in the delivery of those things. So, for example, with the network industries, we've been arguing that we have to have private concessioning of the rail lines, of the port, for example, critically important, because otherwise these things won't work. And if they don't work, we will not have a growing economy, and we will not be able to get people into jobs. We also believe very strongly in decentralization. We believe in a strong and capable state, but not a state that controls everything. And we believe that the Constitution has a good delineation of what the state's responsibility is. The state's responsibility is to ensure the delivery of public goods. And I believe there do have to be state schools because there isn't enough resources without those significant subsidies for people to be able to afford private education across the board. So, for example, the state has a critical role to play in running clinics for very poor people and things like that. So the state has an important role to play in delivering what we call public goods. But the whole story of the Afrikaner is one in which the state delivered public goods, and then individuals and families used the opportunities created by those public goods to rise above poverty and to contribute to the development of a free society. That's the story. And it's the only story that we have to replicate across the board if we want South Africa to work. And in many, many cases, we know that it's not going to work without the private sector, at least in a partnership, or with entire concessioning. What the what the private sector does better, we get out of the way of.
Yes. So the obviously I would like to talk a lot about the Afrikaner story, but I do think one concern, I mean, there's a lot that we should criticize about the past and the apartheid system that should be rejected and all of that. But I do think part of the concern that we have is in terms of the narrative, that looking at the previous century, you're only allowed to say one thing, and that's everything was bad and horrible and evil. But I do think that there are a lot of, and you mentioned some of this now, there are some very important lessons that one can learn from especially the Afrikaner story, the good side and the bad side. And I think part of the good side is this help mekaar movement with the communities, building things. And another part is, I think is what you referred to now, it's also people like Van der Bijl, who played a very significant role in building infrastructure, in modernizing the country with support from the government. And then I think the third part is it came to a point where everything was left to the government and the system collapsed. But we're not allowed to talk about that. And this brings me to, you can comment on that, but to this, I mean, I've been in trouble for some tweets I've made. You've been in more trouble.
Much more trouble.
But what's your view on the let's go freedom of speech? But it's a bit more than that. It's about addressing taboo topics. And what's your? Because a lot of people have said, well, maybe she should stop tweeting. And I know you feel very strongly about that. What's the correct way to approach this?
If we want to solve South Africa's problems, we have to have difficult conversations. We can pretend that these issues don't exist, and then 10 years down the line, people will be saying, well, why didn't you say this then? The time to say things is when it's difficult to say them, not when it's easy to say them, and it's all obvious in retrospect. The time to say things is when you know, projecting from the present, that in 10 years' time, it will have been the right thing to have said. And that is what I believe very strongly. Now, when the whole fallism nonsense arose in South Africa in 2015-16, and everything has to fall. Now, because of critical theory in the United States and other English-speaking countries, this whole notion that everything is a legacy of colonialism and everything is a legacy of white male patriarchy and racism and sexism, everything that they've ever built up must be destroyed, root and branch, to start again and build up enabling institutions and governments. I said, are you crazy? I mean, how do you even begin to decolonize a university? Which is where it all started.
Yes.
Universities in South Africa are a colonial legacy. You can make them inclusive, which is what we all want, and you can improve their quality, which is what we all want. But to talk about dismantling everything that was inherited from colonialism, are you crazy? Electricity reticulation, hospitals, formal education, piped water, transport infrastructure, let's get rid of it all because it's a legacy of white male patriarchy. I mean, it is insane.
Yeah.
And if you look around the world, there are only 3 countries in the world that have never been colonized. That is not the yardstick of whether they become successful. The yardstick on whether they become successful is what they do with the legacy of the past to try and build a better future.
Yes.
And none of these countries that have been unable to build on that legacy have been successful. It's got nothing to do with it. So, you know, these are the things you must say at the time the madness is exploding everywhere. You can't say when all of this madness is going down, it's going to be very controversial if I say this, so perhaps I should rather keep quiet and maybe say it at a better time. By the time the better time arrives will be when it is entirely obvious that what you should have said 10 years ago, you failed to say.
Do you think the back of wokeness has been broken with people like Trump and what's happening all over the world?
Yeah, I do. I think the madness is receding, which is absolutely critical because I always knew America would survive it. Their institutions are strong enough. Their instincts are strong enough. Yeah. If you take those premises and apply them in South Africa, it'll mean institutional collapse. We don't have strong enough and resilient enough institutions to take that kind of assault.
Yes.
And we had to stand up early, very early, to make these points. And I was determined to do that. Now, obviously, the world came down on my head because it was the time of cancel culture and everything. But that's fine. I'm strong enough to take it. Someone else has got to do it. And it might as well be me. And if you want to look at why Trump came into power with such a convincing majority in America, you have to look at the 3 I's, I call it. One is inflation. The other one is immigration. And the third one is identity politics. And people had had enough of that. And Trump was the loudest and most brash and most bold and unafraid opponent of those things.
The bravest.
Yeah.
So, but there's something interesting here, and we see it in America and also in South Africa. There's this thing about the intolerant minority, because most people don't agree with wokeness, but yet it somehow dominates everything. But also in South Africa, I mean, you were a journalist. Maybe you have an interesting perspective on this long ago when you started your career. But it seems that, I don't know if it's, I'd like to hear your view, if it's people who have that ideology, have a stronger proclivity to become journalists and academics, or whether they become that way once they become journalists and academics. But you see wokeness in journalism, you see it in academia, and you see it in you can say the sort of culture, entertainment. But you don't really see it anywhere else.
I've written about this in the past, and I believe it is the former. Let me explain. In humanities faculties at universities throughout the English-speaking world, they've been dominated for as long as living memory by Marxist analysis. And in its crudest terms, it is that the world is divided up into 2 classes of people. One is the villains and the other is the victims. And it is progressive and good to take the side of the victims, and the villains, defined in material terms, are always responsible for the situation of the victims. Now, in America, to a large extent, that traditional Marxism based on class struggle wasn't working anymore. So they had to switch it to race. And the villains and the victims became defined in terms of race and became defined in terms of gender. There was a hierarchy of evil. At the very top of the pyramid of evil was people like you, white heterosexual males. And at the very bottom of the pyramid of evil, that means the most virtuous, were people who have intersectional marginalizations from society. And of course, the people with the least villainous attributes in terms of identity and race and gender have the most virtue by definition, and vice versa. Now, this madness around race and around the valorization of victimhood and equating victimhood with virtue and blaming certain categories of people on the race and gender for being villains in that context, that has gripped humanities faculties across the English-speaking world. And it is insane, but there it is. And it is the root of the entire analysis of why everything must fall. Now, think of who studies in humanities faculties. People who eventually end up dominating the professions that shape public opinion and social consciousness. And that's exactly where the journalists come from. And they believe this is an article of faith.
Yeah.
And you're not allowed to question it. And, you know, when you look at appointments at our universities, those are the yardsticks. Not are you an internationally famous scholar who's making huge progress. It's what the Americans call DEI. And now Trump has issued an executive order saying enough DEI already. And maybe that'll make the pendulum kind of settle.
So let's talk about the Western Cape. Perhaps a broad question to start with. Why? I don't even think I need to ask you whether the Western Cape is being governed better than the rest of the country, because even if you despise the Western Cape government, you can't really disagree with the statistics and the data. So the question is, why is this the case? Why is the Western Cape so unique, so different than the other provinces?
Well, the simple reason is that quite early in our democracy, the voters of the Western Cape voted the DA into power. And we have been in power now almost 20 years. And for the first couple of years, you try and get rid of corruption. You try and stabilize the finances. You try and appoint people on the basis of merit into key positions. And you don't see much of a difference, at least for the first 3 to 5 years. But once you've started a virtuous cycle, it gets reinforced in every term. And now the Western Cape is able to do the most extraordinary things because they have a very strong budget. They don't steal the money. They spend it on the things that has to be spent on. They can hold a strong rates base, and therefore they've got a lot of capital to support the poor and improve their lives. And that's what they do, and that shows.
And so there's talk now, especially from people in the Western Cape and also from different parties, about or questions about the political system and the extent to which, for example, people in the Western Cape are funding certain government programs that they don't agree with and all of that. And then also this links to the issue of devolution, which I know is something that you feel strongly about. So let's talk about that. Why is devolution so important?
Well, we're a federal party, and we believe that government powers should be decentralized and devolved to the lowest effective level. And our Constitution makes provision for that. That can happen. Now, the ANC is incompetent, and it can't really point to a single policy initiative they've taken in the last 30 years that has been a success. But DA governments can, all over the place. And so the things that can be decentralized to functional governments, we want to have decentralized. And especially the network industries, which underpin an economy. All the things that connect people. Communications and broadband and technology infrastructure for technology. Critical network industry. And it's currently in the hands of a state monopoly that can't get a single thing done. The railways. People have moved their transporting of goods from rail to put it on road. It's destroying our roads. And the rail infrastructure is a crucial network industry. Our ports links us to the rest of the world with exports. And those have, by and large, collapsed. So we want the power over those things to be devolved. Cape Town has had enormous success in promoting public safety, for example, through different policies. But we want the power over the Western Cape Police to be decentralized to the Western Cape government and to the city of Cape Town.
Yeah.
And we believe that we can get an enormous amount done. Now, already people across South Africa can compare where the DA governs and where other parties govern. They can see that. So there's no excuse to argue against decentralization, except this ideological madness that says the leader must control the party must control the state, and the state must control the economy. It's an article of faith.
Yes. And so how far does decentralization go? Because self-determination or decentralization can take many forms. It can imply having more control of your budget. It can also imply secession, breaking off of the rest of the country. What are the discussions internally within the DA about the extent to which decentralization should go?
The phrase we use is federal autonomy, but within a federation. And federalism is not secession. If we want to go down a rabbit hole that'll get us nowhere, we can start arguing that the Western Cape must become a separate country. Number one, how are you going to patrol the border? From the Northern Cape right through to the Eastern Cape, passing a whole lot of other provinces in between. What are you going to do? How are you going to stop people? Currently, this government cannot stop people coming from across the whole of Africa into South Africa. You can't achieve that without a war. You can't. So instead of running down after unattainable pipe dreams, let's fight for what we can get under the current constitution, which is substantial devolution of power and federal autonomy.
So you mentioned the ports, you mentioned the railways, the police budget. There are a lot of practical things. The question then is how to achieve this. What ought to be done to get to that position? Well, what's your view?
Well, the Western Cape government has passed what we call the Provincial Powers Act, which then requires for them to drive that very hard. Now, on electricity generation, that's a good one. For years, we had what is known euphemistically as load shedding. And it really dealt a terrible blow to the country's economy. Now, if you look at the Constitution, it says that local government is responsible for energy reticulation and national government is responsible for energy generation. The trouble was that local governments couldn't reticulate because national governments wasn't generating. So we said, well, we've got to do our job under the Constitution. So if you can't generate, we have to generate elsewhere because we have to have electricity to reticulate. So, without asking any permission, our major governments started simply making sure that we expanded the grid, that we got small-scale embedded generation, that we did independent power producer agreements, and that we fed a lot more energy, green energy, into the grid, despite the fact that we weren't allowed to do that. But the Constitutional Court argument would have been, we have to do our job, and we can't do our job if the central government isn't doing theirs. We didn't ask anybody permission. We went ahead, and they didn't dare stop us because they were desperate for more electricity on the grid.
Yeah, of course. Well, Hellen Zille, thank you very much. It's a great honor speaking with you, and thank you for coming on the podcast and sharing some ideas.
It's a great, great pleasure, and it's always good to have an informed and intelligent conversation. Thank you.
Thank you too. Hi, I'm Aaron Struts. If you support this podcast and the work that we are involved with as the Afrikaner Foundation and the broader solidarity movement in South Africa, I want to encourage you to become a more active supporter. You can do this first and foremost by subscribing to our various social media channels, by leaving a comment and sharing what you have seen. But other than that, also by making a small monthly contribution to the work that we are doing through the Afrikaner Foundation's website, or by making a once-off donation. Links in the description.